You know, when we asked Dr. Coburn to come talk about what Kansans really need to know about government spending, we knew it would be a timely topic. But it's even more so now that our legislature has approved another $500 million spending increase for school funding. And it's because the lack of spending control over the last 5 years was really the leading reason that the 2012 tax cuts got reversed last year. Of course, that's not the story that the tax and spend crowd told. Legislators and policymakers across the country were bombarded with a false Kansas narrative that was all designed to discourage other states in this country from ever cutting taxes, trying to claim that the Kansas experience somehow proved that taxes couldn't be cut, even though states like North Carolina, Indiana, and Tennessee all successfully cut taxes at the same time. It was just that the Kansas experience was different. And that's why we decided we had to tell the truth about what was really the matter with the Kansas tax plan so that policymakers across the country could benefit from the lessons learned here in Kansas as they try to improve prosperity in their states. And we were so fortunate and honored to have one of the nation's leading budget hawks write the foreword for that book. Tom Coburn, MD, most recently served as a U.S. Senator from the state of Oklahoma, serving 2 terms from 2005 to 2015. In the Senate, Dr. Coburn was the ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security and also served on the committees of Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs, Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, and Intelligence. They could use a little bit more of that there. From 1995 to 2001, Dr. Coburn represented Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. A family physician, Coburn was a member of the Committee on Commerce, where he sat on the subcommittees of Health and Environment as Vice Chair, Energy and Power, and Oversight and Investigations. He was also selected co-chair of the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS in 2001. A longtime advocate of FDA reform, Dr. Coburn introduced the Promoting Accountability, Transparency, Innovation, Efficiency, and Timeliness at FDA Act with Senator Richard Burr in 2012. And Dr. Coburn continued to see patients while he was in Congress. He's a graduate of Oklahoma State University and the University of Oklahoma Medical School. His specializations are family medicine, obstetrics, and allergy. He's written 3 books on Washington politics, and his most recent book is entitled Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop America's Runaway Government. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving Dr. Coburn a very warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon. I always leave Prozac at the exit when you get ready to leave because the story is pretty depressing. And I don't have a lapel mic. Oh, yes, I do. Right here. No? Okay, I don't. It's great that you all would come out. Honored to be able to speak with you. You know, Dave wanted me, I wrote a foreword for this book because I saw what was happening in Kansas, and I see what's happening all across the country. We have these false narratives that are put forward about bureaucracies not having enough money. And the fact is nobody does zero-based budgeting. Nobody has a performance measure indicators to see how efficient things are happening. And has anybody compared the size of the bureaucracy in Kansas compared to the size of what it was 10 years ago? Or in Oklahoma? Where bureaucracies haven't grown is in the states that don't have income taxes. That's where bureaucracies haven't grown. That's where bureaucracies aren't protected. And so Coburn's rule on bureaucracies is they never do what's best when they can do what's safe for the bureaucracy. So as we look at what goes on in state governments and federal governments, is we have to understand that the number one goal of bureaucracy is to expand their base and secure their base so that they'll be there next year. And so efficiency is the opposite of what you see in bureaucracies. I think there's a couple of things I want to share with you before I get into specifics about Kansas. There are 4 things that are required of a republic for it to be able to survive. One is limited government. We don't have limited government in Oklahoma, and we don't have limited government nationally. And the whole design of our founders was that we would have a small and efficient and limited chore list for our federal government. And we have everything but that. And if you think about 40% of the budget for Kansas's legislature, they don't get to decide how the money's spent. An unelected bureaucrat in Washington is deciding how the money is spent. And you have no control over it, even though all the money's raised right here in your own state, because they have usurped the power of enumerated powers, and some bureaucracy through statutory regulation has now made law. The U.S. Constitution annotated today weighs 47 pounds versus the little booklet that you carry in your pocket. That's the Constitution that we have. So we got to have limited government. Second is you got to have respect for the rule of law. It has to be honored. It has to be trusted. And so it's not just having the rule of law, but what do people think about the rule of law? And what we've seen is we now have the rule of rulers instead of the rule of law. Because as we've seen all this mess in Washington unfold, what we've seen is the application of law is different depending on which team you're on, which undermines people's feeling about the rule of law. Same thing on immigration. The reason people get upset about immigration isn't because somebody's Hispanic or some other background. They get upset because if you don't have to follow the rule of law and you're not a citizen, that means I still have to. So there's a difference. So we undermine the rule of law. Third thing is economic freedom. The United States of America led the world for 200 years as number one in economic freedom. Anybody have any idea where we are today? 17th. We're dropping one every year. That means 17 other countries, it's easier to start a business, grow a business, build a business, and have the capital for that business than it is in our country. Well, our economic freedom is one of the things that built us, that and the rule of law. And then finally, what our founders told us is none of this works unless you have a virtuous society. And you kind of look around, and what we accept as a society now because it's politically correct is totally opposite of what virtue is. We're told we can't shame a kid in school. You know, I tell a story about Acadia, and I'll end up with it. But the fact is discipline matters. And persistence matters. And consistency matters. And we've lost that in our educational system. What we've said is, whatever we want to do, it's okay. And yet we have a system of education, and in Kansas, you're not nearly as bad as Oklahoma. We have 552 school districts. Think about it. I mean, you have way too many school districts, and that doesn't mean you abandon the nature and the color and the community of the individual school districts, but how about just some smart thinking about how we manage the operation of schools outside of the teaching of schools? We could save hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year in every state from Nebraska to Oklahoma to Kansas. So all these things are achievable. The number one thing Kansas did when they cut taxes that killed their tax cut is they spent more money. And as somebody who spent 16 years trying to figure out how to cut spending, I can tell you, most people don't have the backbone to cut spending. Because even waste, even fraud, even stupidity has a constituency. And here's the conflict of interest. How dare I not have somebody not like me? I might not get reelected. And here's my motto. The greatest thing that can happen to you in an election is to lose it because you stood on principle and character. And we don't hear that. We don't see that model. We don't see examples of that. What we see is cowardice based on the convenience of the moment, so I don't have to address what is a difficult issue. So consequently, Kansas like the federal government, you're just kicking it down the road. And let me shine this little light on for you. I wrote the debt bomb 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe it's longer than that. Maybe it was 7 or 8 years ago. As I get into my 70s, I can't remember anything. Nobody here can relate to that, I'm sure. But here's where it is today. We have 85 million millennials. The unfunded liabilities from a conservative standpoint, and that's mine, versus Kalitlikov, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner at MIT, his estimate is $400 trillion. I'm saying it's $144 trillion, but just listen to what $144 trillion is over the next 50 years for your kids that are under 28. It's $33,000 a year in additional taxes or decreased standard of living or money printed by the Federal Reserve creating tremendous inflation. So that's, by the way, that's what we're leaving our kids. So Kansas can actually kind of come back and do the things they need to do. You know, you're 4 decades long into an economic no movement. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is you're a high-tax state. And it's not just your state government. It's your county government and your city governments. You realize that in Kansas, where's this number here? I think this number's right. You correct me if I'm wrong. Where is he? There he is. Is you have 30% more employees per 1,000 people than everybody else in the country, on average. Government employees. You have 1.3 times the average of the rest of the states. All right, so, and that's just part of the problems. The states that have raised taxes have lower economic growth. The states have raised taxes have lower job creation. The states that have no income tax and have transparency in their government grow at 50% a rate faster than your GDP will grow. So it's and these are principles. It doesn't apply to Kansas or Oklahoma. It applies to everybody. If in fact we're good stewards with taxpayer money, we'll get to keep our kids at home. Do you realize 2 out of every 3 kids that graduate from a university in the state of Oklahoma leave the state? I bet it's true here. I don't know what the numbers are here. But here, what's your most precious asset? Your youth. Where's the job creation going to come? Where's the commerce going to come if it doesn't come from your offspring? Are people just going to move to Kansas? I would. I love it. You know, I love coming to Kansas. But the fact is they're not. So you had this false narrative created because your legislature didn't have the backbone to do what was necessary once they cut taxes. And if you're in this room, I'm aiming it right at you. Stand up with some guts and start fixing what's wrong with Kansas. Start holding the Kansas agencies accountable. Start speaking up and not let leadership bend at their knees because something's not politically popular, but yet it's great for your future and it's great for your kids and it's great in the long term to grow the GDP of Kansas. I learned a whole lot about people. I knew a lot as a practicing physician. One of my favorite courses, the only C I ever made in med school, made A in every other course in med school except human behavior, because I resisted all the garbage that was mixed in with some of the great stuff that they taught. And when they tested, I knew the answer they wanted. I wouldn't give it to them. But the fact is we see tremendous behavior problems out of politicians. And here's the problem, is they're conflicted. They can't figure out if they really want to do the right thing or really want to get reelected. And guess what the default position is? And it doesn't matter whether they have an R, a D, or an I after their name. They're all the same. I mean, ask yourself, what just happened in Washington? The next 6 months, we're going to spend 30% more than we did the same 6 months in last year? And oh, by the way, none of it's paid for. It's all borrowed. And oh, by the way, there were no amendments, and you couldn't read the bill. And that's run by Republican leaders. What's happening to us? We're losing our country because we're losing the character traits that make us a great country. So if you come back to take Kansas as a model and say, everybody said, well, we shouldn't have cut taxes, we have all these problems. What you should have done is this: create a bicameral, bipartisan committee that's permanent, that's at the Capitol 24/7, 12 months a year, that has subpoena power, that brings people in from all the agencies and asks them the questions about what they're doing under oath. I mean, just establishing that committee will save you 5% the first year. The second thing they should do is pass a bill that says all spending in Kansas, other than personal spending for health care or security, will be published on a website that every Kansan can see. That doesn't cost much. It's not hard to do. Kansas went and paid $3 million for a study on what to do to be more financially conservative. Your legislature totally ignored it. So they spend $3 million that has $2 billion worth of savings over the next 5 years in it, and they don't pay any attention to it. You also lack in Kansas the capability to properly forecast what your revenue is going to be. And then, because you don't have a constitutional convention and can't, you have to do that through the will of the people, you now have your Supreme Court acting as your legislature. Things are upside down. I told you you're going to need Prozac. Don't look at me so sadly. There's not one problem in front of Kansas, in front of Oklahoma, or in front of the country we can't fix. We just have to change the fixers. And I'm not talking about who you send up there. I'm talking about each one of you starting to get engaged and not taking, yes, we'll do it, and then not following up to see if they did it. It's called accountability. And accountability doesn't exist in Oklahoma. We just had a $750 million tax increase. Not one agency's been looked at thoroughly in 40 years in Oklahoma. And the Republicans that have veto-proof majority in both houses did nothing to do any oversight. Nothing. It kind of sounds like Kansas. So how did we get here? We got here because the game is being played rather than leadership's being played. And it's time to put people there that don't want a career there, that don't want the strokes, that actually want to fix things. And it's also time for absolute transparency in Kansas on every penny that's spent. Because once you start publishing that, you won't tolerate it anymore. The fact is it's all hidden by the bureaucracies. There's not big hunks of fat. There's little fat all through every one of your bureaucracies and state agencies. Every one of them is loaded with fat. If they went to the doctor would put them on Lipitor, and you want to get rid of that bad fat. Except that's not happening either. So what has to happen is people who are interested like you and through the Kansas Policy Institute, we need to start moving this in a direction so that at least they feel some little bit of uncomfort about what they've done and how they're doing it today. I mean, I'm amazed at Oklahoma and Kansas. I don't know about you all. I'm amazed. You know, the 6th largest economy in the world is Texas. They don't have a state income tax. Their legislature meets for 3 months every other year, right? But they do have oversight committees. They do look to see how money's being spent. There is transparency, and their GDP growth is 4 times what yours is. And they don't have the first income tax. Same thing with Tennessee, growing like crazy. Florida, growing like crazy. North Dakota adding people? Are you sure? Yeah. They have no income tax, and they're growing their population because they have no income tax, because it's a great way to make a better living, because there's less of a burden of government. So you need to read Dave's book if you really want to understand what happened. You were failed by your leadership in Kansas. You weren't failed because you cut taxes. You were failed because they didn't have the courage to cut spending, and they increased taxes. And you're doing it again, as I just heard you say. So I'll end up with a story about Katie, and then we'll take any questions. Katie was a little girl. Her dad put her to bed one evening. She's 4 years old. Brushed her teeth, gave her a drink of water. She said, "Daddy," about 2 minutes later, "I need a drink of water." He said, "Honey, I just put you to bed. Go to sleep." About 5 minutes later, Katie comes in, gets up and sits on the side of the bed and says, "Daddy, I want a drink of water." He says, "Honey, you just had a drink of water. Now you go back, lie down, or I'm going to have to," in Oklahoma I say spank, I'll say discipline for you all. I'm going to discipline you. You see, there's that political correctness that even works into funny stories. So about 10 minutes go by, and Katie says, "Daddy, when you come spank me, will you bring me a glass of water?" Well, there's some points to that are really important. Katie knew what she wanted. Katie was persistent about what she wanted, and Katie was willing to pay the price for what she wanted. Are you all willing to pay the price? Are you willing to be persistent to get Kansas back where it needs to be? And it's not going to happen through your legislatures. It's only going to happen through you. It's only going to happen through the individuals in the states that are going to rise up and say, "We're just not going to do this anymore. We're going to go back to the principles that make this a great state, a great country." And that's limited government. That's economic freedom. That's the rule of law. And we're going to start teaching virtue again in our school. And we're going to fight that can be taught rather than shunned or disciplined. Because we will not survive, and no republic ever has survived under the political culture that we see in our country today. And no country in 800 years of economic history has ever survived the total debt that this country has today. None. And those aren't my words. Those are Nobel Peace Prize winners in economics. So there's not anything we can't fix, but it requires us to be active. You can't sit back and gripe about it. You have to go do something. I was in 32 states last year trying to do something, and that's Convention of States, where we actually have a Convention of State limited for amendments to put the federal government back in its position and start making decisions here based on the authority that we were given originally in the original Constitution. All right, any questions back and forth? Or have I thoroughly depressed you? Yes, sir. Well, three, subject matter is a balanced budget amendment with generally accepted accounting principles. In other words, right now the government cheats. You don't know it, but they'll publish a deficit. And then if you look at what they put out, what the CBO and OMB puts out, you'll say, well, you had a deficit of $600 billion, but your debt went up $1.8 trillion. How do you account for that? Well, they can't, because the deficit actually went up more than what they published. And last year, for example, unfunded liabilities grew $7 trillion in this country. In 1 year, the debt grew $1.6 trillion, but the deficit was only published at a little under $500 billion. So you think they're giving you good numbers? No, they're giving you politically expedient numbers. That's first. Second thing is limit the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government. There was a case in 1921 called the Coburn case that markedly expanded the Commerce Clause, which is what gives the federal government the power to come in here and tell you, here's how you're going to do your schools, here's how you're going to do your roads, here's how you're going to do your farming, here's how you're going to do everything. And that Coburn case said interstate commerce is interstate commerce even if it doesn't impact interstate commerce. And there's a farmer who grew 18 acres more wheat than what the wheat board would allow him. He never sold any of it. He used it all to feed his pigs and replant and feed his family. And they ruled an expansion of the Commerce Clause, which now allows the federal government to tell every agency in Kansas what they will and won't do. And oh, by the way, they bribed you because here's a grant. They take your money, here's your money, but now you have to do it our way. Thomas Jefferson said the only way the federal government can be involved in education is if there's an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Those aren't my words, that's Thomas Jefferson's word. We've spent $3.8 trillion from the Department of Education since 1978. Not one parameter anywhere in the country is better, and 22 are worse, since the federal government started mandating how we will and won't run our schools. And if all you have to do is go back and look at the Johnson War on Poverty. The War on Poverty, we had 13.6% of Americans that were considered under the poverty line in 1963. We have 14.5%. Now we have 100 million more people. We've spent $32 trillion on those programs. My question to you is, when you make somebody dependent, do you help them or do you hurt them? It's tyranny. Earned success is how they become happy when you tell them. Here's a number that most people won't believe. The percentage of absent fathers in 1963 in the homes of white people were greater than the percentage of absent fathers in the homes of African Americans. Think about what we did with our programs. We abandoned the African American families, what we did. So the answer doesn't lie in government, the answer lies in us. And we can fix all those programs. So that's the middle one, is restore the General Welfare Clause to what its original intent was, restore the Commerce Clause to what its original intent, and then finally term limits. Not just on appointed, not just on elected officials, appointed officials as well. So that's the three things. It can't be prostituted. Everybody runs around, oh, you're going to take my guns away. That's total impossibility. And here's why it's an impossibility. We've become so focused, we don't trust other Americans. Everywhere I go, I'll have somebody at some state legislature, you can't trust Kansas to do that. I said, when was the last time you were in Kansas? I said, sure you can. So what happens is the state legislatures are, so what do? Not fix it? Our country was built on courage, not on fear. And our founders, here's what George Mason said during the Constitutional Convention. Gentlemen, we've made a grievous error. Do you know any time in history where a government has voluntarily ceded power back to its people? And of course, these were very learned individuals. They said, no, of course it hadn't. Said, then we have to allow the states the ability to amend this Constitution. The states, not the Congress, the states. And they all went. And Madison records that was the only event during the Constitutional Convention that didn't have any debate, because everybody knew it was absolutely right. So the way to do this is for us to fix it, because they may fix it when we have 32 states and we only need 34 to go. But you have to fix it, and you can't complain anymore. There's ways to fix it. There's ways to fix Kansas, but it can't be your elected representative fixing Kansas. It has to be you fixing Kansas. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we all know that one of the biggest growth, or one of the largest growth in budget deficit are entitlements, like Medicare and Social Security. President Trump doesn't want to do anything about it. He wants to ignore the problem. We only have a few more years left, 17 years for Social Security before it goes broke. Who's going to stand up and deal with this third rail?
Well, Joe Lieberman and I had a bill. I'll just tell you, we had a bill for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And we took it to Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell and said, well, you can't put that on the floor. We said, why not? It's a bipartisan bill. We all participate. We slowly take care of this problem. And yes, people of means aren't going to get near the benefit that people have no means, and over a period of time. But just remember, who started Medicare Part D? Yeah, where's the tax revenue to pay for that? There was none. So nobody's innocent on this. So how do you do it? If you force them to have to make a balanced budget amendment, in other words, if you do a spinal implant into the members of Congress where they have to address these issues, they will. And it's okay to lose by doing the right thing for our country. It's okay. It's either all going to come crashing down or we're going to start making hard decisions. And there's no other way out. As soon as the bid to cover ratio on U.S. bonds hits 1.0, it's over for us. It's over for us. And you think China isn't rattling their $1.8 trillion worth of debt right in Donald Trump's face saying, oh, you want to have a trade war? Well, we'll dump $1.8 trillion of your debt. And your interest rates will go to 12%. What do you think about that? I mean, being in debt to other countries, we did it to England. And we stopped a war England was getting ready to have because we held so much of their debt. We said, we're going to dump your debt. So we're not just impacted because of our debt. Our foreign policy is impacted because of our debt. So what you have to do is you have to say, where are the courageous men and women in this country that wanted to stay together, that wanted to survive? I mean, I think we cheat history. I'm all for us cheating history. We can cheat history. Our country can survive. Our republic can be strong. But it can't be strong as long as our politicians aren't straight with us and as long as their number one goal is getting reelected, not fixing the real problems that face our country. And there's too many of that in Washington, in Topeka, and in Oklahoma City. It's about getting an attaboy rather than doing the right thing. End of my sermon. Sorry. Anybody else? All right.
Thank you, Dr. Coburn, for those words of wisdom and clarity and honesty. We could all use a lot more than that, more of that. I imagine some of you sitting in the audience listening to Dr. Coburn are thinking when he honestly challenges you, because he's right. Legislators aren't going to fix this. If we want it fixed, it's up to us. Some of you are probably wondering, can we really do that? I know we can, because we've seen you do it. You know, we've had a lot of policy victories over the years, covering a lot of different topics. Two things keep coming up. First, we're told these ideas can't possibly be passed because, you're going up against very powerful opposition and a very reluctant legislature. The other thing that keeps coming up is we find ways to make those ideas possible. Maybe not overnight, but certainly over time. We do it by raising awareness, then taking action, and holding them accountable. It can be done. We've seen it happen. And the way we look at it is, it's going to be, it kind of comes down to two different philosophical approaches. There was Gandhi who said, you must be the change you want to see in the world. And sometimes that's not easy to do. But if you're not willing to be the change you want to see in the world, then that other philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said it's going to be like deja vu all over again. Do you want the change enough to push people to be accountable? And we're so grateful for so many of you who are members of Kansas Policy Institute and have helped us over the years have one after another victory. If you'd like to share the message in what was really the matter with Kansas, it's available on Amazon. We also have some books available at the office. We're not allowed to sell them because we're not a licensed retailer, but we can make them available for a suggested donation of $10 if you want to share some with your friends. On your book, on your table also, we just published this morning, the 2018 Green Book, that has some amazing facts in here, like Dr. Coburn was talking about the spending. Texas doesn't have no taxes because it has all that oil. It's because they only spend $2,691 per resident, whereas Kansas spends $3,808 per resident. Now, we all have education, we all have transportation, we have social programs. It's actually the states that tax income now spend 50% more per resident than the states without an income tax. It's simply a matter of having the courage to hold government accountable, each one of us, to make that happen. There's some amazing statistics in here. We're happy to provide that for you today. Once again, thank you so much for being here.